Okay, you're rolling.
All right, everyone, let's get started. And I'd like actually to begin things with a brief educational video on the proper way to establish IT security, credibility, and expertise. I apologize that the audio is not the optimum, but hopefully the main points will get across.
Of the biggest stars in the industry today.
That's right. In fact, I'm surprised that the two of us can be in the same video at the same time and not have the whole thing spontaneously explode from the sheer InfoSec awesomeness that is here. Oh yeah. So, you want to be an InfoSec rock star,
But you've never owned a system,
never found an exploit,
never written advisory,
you don't know how to code.
never been on ILC or even know what it is.
The best part about being an InfoSec rock star is you don't need to know anything.
You don't even need to know how to play guitar.
Although if you can play a little rock band, that can help.
To get started, image is everything.
Wear black,
Grow a beard and long hair.
get a cool pair of shades.
Wear a pink tutu.
Always make fun of other people for any reason.
Start a war on Twitter on things you don't know anything about.
Go to every con you can, or at least tweet as if you were there.
Speak as many cons as you can, even if you don't know what you're talking about.
It's even better if you have no idea what you're talking about,
When in doubt, create a new term for existing vulnerabilities.
like referring to SQLI injection as cyber tunneling.
Cross-site scripting as cross-dressing.
And nothing gets you more credibility as an InfoSec rockstar than getting as many certifications as possible.
Says,
Security A+. Yeah!
and that's what I'm talking about.
Be sure to tweet about how much you hate to travel.
Be sure to mention your platinum diamond Uber status.
Okay, let's stop things there. And I hope some of the main points of that video, although the audio was limited, got through. Because I'd like to use that as the basis to formally present my own credentials. At least I heard you, I hope you got the reference to the pink tutu at least. But seriously, and it is my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you about a very serious and important topic today. My name is Mike Nescott. I'm with JBS International, a leading government contractor in North Bethesda, Maryland. For those of us with the responsibility of managing content management systems, being able to evaluate and manage the security of these platforms effectively has critical implications, obviously, for the precious information of our clients and our users, our own good credibility and reputation, and in many cases, our livelihoods. Now, a lot of my colleagues at JBS International and I recently had the pleasure of attending DrupalCon Portland. And there we saw Dries, who's the founder and top drop at Drupal, present what is known as his traditional State of Drupal speech, where he talked about the recent inroads that Drupal has made in gaining widespread acceptance in the government and academia, and he talked about how the next imperative was to have the platform gain broader acceptance in the commercial market. And he talked about marketing more effectively based on these types of features. You'll note that one of the features that's not listed there is security. It is implicit in perhaps in many of the features that are listed, but as far as primary marketing features, for many of our clients, it is one of those. if not the most prominent one. If it's not the reason the CMS platform will be chosen, it may be the reason it's not chosen. In evaluating different CMSs, however, we're dealing with a situation where all of these systems are operating in an increasingly complex environment. I think many of us are aware of this. On the front end, you have an increasing array of devices coming at the system from an expanding geographical base. Some of the folks using these systems have good intentions, some not so good intentions. On the back end, you have these systems connecting to an increasingly diverse set of services and data resources, from geolocation to the myriad types of social networking systems, to the infamous big data sources. These back-end systems also challengingly have a broad array of security profiles and potential threats that are quite dynamic and often difficult to evaluate. So the resulting pressure on the systems and those of us who manage them is too often this. Adding to the difficulty, as we saw in the video, is the fact that because we are dealing with a complex environment, is increasingly open to speculation, misinterpretation, misrepresentation, and hype. IT security has often been that way, and it's probably, because of the complexity, becoming, unfortunately, even more so. In dealing with a complex environment like that, it's often very useful to be able to step back and take a look at how some of the different subsystems within that environment are responding to, adapting to, and managing that complexity. So with that in mind, I thought that we take a look at how Drupal compares with some of the other content management platforms that are out there in terms of the broad security landscape. So we're going to be looking briefly at the security environment and capabilities of Drupal, Joomla, WordPress, Liferay, and SharePoint. This is, of course, by no means a comprehensive collection, nor necessarily even a representative collection of CMSs. There are thousands of them. There's a new one every 5 minutes. And you could spend the rest of your life arguing about what exactly a CMS is. For those of you, however, who were able to attend the excellent keynote that preceded this session, you'll note that of the 4 finalists that this gentleman talked about from Georgia in terms of content management systems, Drupal, Joomla, and WordPress were among those. And then Liferay and SharePoint were also among the systems that were considered. And it's also, I think, instructive because Drupal, Joomla, and WordPress are widely considered and often compared as being the leading open source content management systems, even though they often have very different use cases. Liferay is a leading CMS with growing interest on the Java platform, which was widely implemented in the government and many other places. And then SharePoint is a leading commercial system by Microsoft. Liferay is also an interesting case because it's a common model in open source where you have a commercial entity, which is Liferay, which is sponsoring the system, but then there's a community version. This is a very common model in open source. It's interesting to compare this with the other mix of systems. We're going to be looking at how these systems broadly compare in these general areas. First of all, the code repository. We'll take a look at the API and security there. The overall security management platform model that the platform and the community use, which is going to be critical as we see. And then for those of us very interested in the government realm, some of the specific security controls and tools that are available with these systems and how you can respond to the requirements you might have in terms of your system's regulation and governance. We first take a look at where these repositories are maintained. We see that there's reflected here a broad movement in technology to move to distributed version control systems such as Git, and into hosting the repositories on public resources such as GitHub, Bitbucket, those types of things. So Drupal, as you may be aware, recently moved from Git to Git from Subversion. Joomla, the main repository, is maintained on GitHub. WordPress has a Git mirror of their system, which is maintained on Subversion. I have no idea what SharePoint uses. It's closed source. Most people doing SharePoint development, we do a lot of that, will use Microsoft TFS, Team Foundation Server, to manage the repository. And then LifeRay is often also on GitHub. So how does this have a direct impact on security? Well, it's interesting. If we look at two cases in recent years in which major operating systems had their repositories compromised. And then FreeBSD and Linux, these are two operating systems that are noted for their security. So in the case of FreeBSD, which is maintained on Subversion, their repository was compromised last year. It basically took them about 6 months to really fully recover and get things rebuilt. And this is because apparently they had a very difficult time determining exactly what had been compromised. For those of you who've had to deal with rootkits, you know how difficult it can be when people have, covered up their footprints to figure out exactly where you're at and to get back to a normal state. If we contrast this to what happened several years earlier, where the Linux.kernel, Linux.org kernel site was compromised, it's interesting to note that, and you may be aware that Git actually was developed by Linus Torvalds, who is the founder of Linux as well. They were able to recover relatively quickly, within a few weeks. And a lot of people conclude this is because they were using Git, which, because it's a distributed system, had that repository shared in the complete form among thousands, perhaps millions of folks out there. And those distributed repositories could serve as the basis for a relatively quick recovery. Also, key is the fact that every object in Git is cryptographically verifiable. So it's comparatively easy to determine if something has been tampered with. And I think this gets to a key point in security, which is that you need to have the humility to have the systems that you expect to be attacked and broken into. As we see from these two, these are security experts who had their systems compromised, but their systems were resilient. But in the case of the Linux kernel, the system, as with some of these CMS platforms now, was resilient enough. It was built to recover relatively quickly from that compromise. Let's look now just briefly at the way these APIs are currently designed and where they're moving towards, and how that impacts on security. As you may be aware, Drupal is moving from what has traditionally been a procedural hook-based system to a more object-oriented system in Drupal 8, built on components of the Symfony framework, adhering to a standard of PHP language development, which is known as PSR2. So what does this mean in terms of security? Well, there are many who would argue that the more object-oriented the code is, the more modular it is, the easy it is to test, the easy it is to find security flaws, to remove those without unexpected impact on the rest of the systems, the easier it is to share code, to reuse code, to take libraries from other systems. The less you have to manage yourself, the less you have to write yourself, the less chance there is that you're going to screw up from a security standpoint. The more you're going to be able to take the best of what's out there and take advantage of that and not have to redo it yourself. Joomla also is built, and it's an interesting case in which they've actually separated the framework out from the CMS. But that and the CMS is built on top of the framework. Their framework is design patterns oriented, object oriented. They've got an MVC pattern as the development model. If you're familiar with design patterns, they have the Joomla development technology is strongly built on things like factory objects and the observer pattern. WordPress has often been compared to Drupal in terms of its hook system. They've got actions and filters. It's a traditional procedural system. SharePoint has its own proprietary system built on top of .NET, and then Java is built on the JVM. And both of these are also, you can consider them somewhat object-oriented in their focus. If we look at a little bit more detail in the API security that you get with these systems, if you look at the three PHP systems, they all have somewhat comparable functions that are available to filter input, to make sure that it's clean, to make sure that if people submit forms, they submit data, that it's not going to inject script onto the system, that you're going to be able to avoid vulnerabilities such as SQL injection. You'll note that Drupal also has form tokens, which help protect against what is known as CSRF, cross-site request forgery. There is, in terms of protecting the login and sessions, there's strong password and hashing algorithms built into Drupal. And note the last word on the Drupal description is twig. And that refers to the new templating engine that's going to be used in Drupal 8. That's important because it's not uncommon among these three PHP platforms for there to be compromises based on PHP code that's included in the templates. That's a very common case. And so recognizing that Drupal has moved partly from a security standpoint to move to Twig, which is which restricts basically the PHP code that you can inject into the system. It's more a text-oriented type of templating engine. If you look at LifeRay, they have an interesting concept where they have the person who manages the CMS has the opportunity to implement what is known as a portal access control list and a security manager. So when this is implemented, if you have a module, it has to adhere to the PACL limits you've set on that system. And if it tries to do things that it's not authorized to do, it will not be able to do that. They also have a filtering system that's built on, interestingly named the anti-SAMI hook. I don't know where they came up with that, but it's actually built on. They got assistance from the OWASP project, and you may be familiar with that. That's an open source initiative on web security. SharePoint has their object model that's fairly highly abstract, keeps people away from keeps development away from the low level of the database where there's more risk. It's built on top of the .NET framework, and so takes advantage of some of the filtering capabilities there. And SharePoint, interestingly enough, in the latest version, 2013, is trying to move development to an app model where code is kept off the SharePoint platform. And I think this is another leading trend in security. In Drupal, there's also an initiative to increase the capabilities of what are known as the REST API, so you can do more of your custom development away from the core system and limit the vulnerability that you'd have there if you're actually deploying stuff on Drupal itself. Despite the fact that you could argue you have a significant level of protection with all these systems, if you look at vulnerabilities on any of these systems, there's no shortage of them. I did some research using the NVD, which is the National Vulnerability Database. It's a public resource that many people use to keep up to date on security vulnerabilities. And if you look at a 3-year tally of the different vulnerabilities, as you see across these different systems a range of the common exploits that you commonly find with these systems. Cross-site scripting, SQL injection, access bypass, code execution. Despite the protections that are available with these systems, people still make mistakes all the time, and it is imperative that you constantly patch these systems regardless of which platform you're dealing with. Perhaps just as important as how many vulnerabilities there are, and I think it's important to point out you can't directly really compare those numbers because in some cases they roll up these vulnerabilities are rolled up with different patches, and they may announce multiple vulnerabilities. It's difficult to actually determine in some cases how many vulnerabilities are part of an announcement. But as we can see, there's no shortage with any of them. It's perhaps just as important to look, however, at how
Also, those vulnerabilities would depend on which modules were installed. The number of vulnerabilities would depend on which module.
That's true. No, this is very true, and it's not only which ones are installed, but the fact that those vulnerabilities are actually across different versions of systems, and it's often also dependent upon the installation base. So Drupal, it's widely cited fact that Drupal is like 1% of the internet. The WordPress community often throws out the figure that it's 18% of the internet. So the more systems you have, the larger the community, the more modules you're going to have to develop for that system, or the broader the reach. So it's very difficult to compare exactly. But speaking of WordPress, there's been a lot of publicity recently about significant vulnerabilities in WordPress extensions, plugins. And a couple months ago, in fact, a security research firm determined that 20% of the leading WordPress plugins had significantly previously unrecognized security flaws, including 7 of the top 10 e-commerce platforms. And they, in issuing this report, bemoaned the fact that the WordPress platform had not taken a little bit more responsibility in managing the security that had been practiced in their own community and platform. And it's interesting to note, if you look in some detail at how these different platforms manage their security from a community standpoint, there are somewhat vast differences about how that is done, about how hands-on the community is in terms of its approach to security. And Drupal, if we look at this comparatively, is a very active community from a standpoint of security management. Drupal, Joomla, and LifeRay all have dedicated security teams. In the case of Drupal and Joomla, they're volunteer teams. In the case of LifeRay, it is a team that's partially composed of people from the company that developed the platform and partially from volunteers. The Drupal security team, among their responsibilities, resolve issues, assist module maintainers in developing secure code. They produce documentation on security, including, and very importantly, a secure coding guide that serves as the basis for what is known as the full project review. If you're a developer who wants to take a module and get it onto listed on Drupal.org, there's a very structured process where typically you will put this in a sandbox project first, and then it will undergo a complete code review based on guidelines partially developed by the security team. And it's explicitly stated, if you read the documentation on the module review process, that security is actually the most important component of that review. And it's done in a very open fashion, so if you look at the sandbox projects and then the back and forth between the development team and the people who review these, you can actually see how this process unfolds in real time. And the people, how they respond, the way in which the review people determine that there are potential vulnerabilities in this code and how these things are resolved. Comparison, even these other platforms who have security teams take a much less hands-on approach. So for example, the Joomla security team maintains what is known as a vulnerable extension list. They're actively involved in managing the security of the core project, but as far as extensions go, they have a form that allows other people to report these potential vulnerabilities, but they also encourage people to first contact the people who develop them. And then, if you're identified as having a vulnerability, you are asked to fill out a form to get yourself off this blacklist. It's a relatively brief form in which you just have to report that you fixed this vulnerability. There's not really much in the way of verification from that team that this has happened. The LifeRay security team also is more focused on the core platform. They have an app marketplace, and they do review these applications, but it's mainly for compatibility and performance on the system. They determine, they support different types of databases, different types of application servers. They assure that that your extension can run cleanly in all these. However, because it's Java, you actually, and it's compiled by bytecode, you don't actually have to release the source code of the system. With SharePoint, they're trying to, as many products are now, also move people to buying things from an app store. And there's a review process there that is, similar to what you'd see, I guess, in the Apple App Store, where, of course, it says you're prohibited from having insecure applications listed in the App Store. Whether that's true or not, it's up to you trusting that system, obviously. So I'd like to look now at, especially for those of us dealing with FSBA requirements, the need to have our application certified to operate in the federal government, how you respond to the requirements for different types of security controls that you need to have implemented on the system. First of all, we take a look at the capabilities in terms of roles and permissions from these systems. As you may be familiar from a Drupal standpoint, there's a very flexible, granular capability to define different roles and permissions it can be challenging in managing the complexity of this system, as you may be aware. And we have often found, as many others have, that this is where Drupal distributions or third-party modules can provide some assistance. I know the Open Atrium is a leading Drupal distribution. They focused a lot on being able to give you, to take that rather flat security matrix and manage it in a more tree-like fashion, where you can inherit permissions on different levels. And when you're dealing with secure data, you often have those types of requirements, where you have different levels of access, and you need to inherit permissions. If you're trying to manage that yourself, it can get hairy. And a system like that abstracts it away from you is often very helpful. We make use of the Workbench module in our work very extensively, and this is a module that helps you manage workflow. Many cases, you'll have a security model that involves some type of approval process or different people having to give access to others in terms of content. This is something that the Workbench module and workflow can handle. So we look at some of these other systems and how they compare. Joomla and WordPress come with, perhaps you could argue, some capabilities that are more separated from the onset. Joomla has the concept of front-end and back-end groups. WordPress has some out-of-the-box rules and capabilities that are very attuned, not surprisingly, to the publishing model, where you have editors and content administrators and those types of things. SharePoint has groups and roles that are, in many cases, very tightly integrated with the Active Directory system. And then Liferay has a granular system. There's actually a Java, apparently it's called JSR 286, which is a standard way of implementing permissions and roles in what are known as portlet applications. They take advantage of the built-in model that's available with that. We next consider the very important capabilities that these systems provide us in terms of controlling people's ability to authenticate and gain access to the system and different pieces underlying the system. As we're all aware, there's an increasing recognition that passwords are just broken. That it's gotten to the point where we have so many passwords that just can't be managed effectively. You end up using either a complex password management system, and it takes you 50 minutes to input that password into your phone because you can't, do cut and paste on the virtual keyboard, or you end up using your dog's name on every system. And let me say, if you try to hack into my systems, I never had a dog named Shadow.
Did it have an exclamation point?
That's right. So we see a lot more support with all these systems for federated identity providers such as OpenID and devices that allow you to do what is known as multi-factor authentication. So you might use your smartphone, or you might use a token such as YubiKey. Some of you may be familiar with that. A lot of these systems are supporting both of those options. And with Drupal, there's with what is known as the TFA SMS module, there's a lot of capabilities for rolling your own system, where you can have this system send out an SMS message with a code to your device. You have to enter that code into the system as an additional means on top of the password of proving who you are, what you have. A key limitation with that approach, though, is that for those of us dealing with the federal government, those systems for better or worse, are outside the purview of the federal government. So in the case of Drupal, we've used a module that implements the SAML protocol, which is the Security Assertion Markup Language Protocol. This basically is a standard for federated authentication. We do quite a bit of work with NIH and a number of their systems. We've been able to integrate NIH login with our Drupal installations using this SAML module. And so people in the government and other contractors who have NIH usernames and passwords can use those same credentials to authenticate to Drupal, and you don't have to manage those passwords locally. That allows you, obviously, to take advantage also of the capabilities and verification available on those external systems. What that does not give you the capability to do is to, more and more federal agencies are relying, there's an initiative known as HPSD that uses people have to, use these smart cards to authenticate. And there's an inherent challenge in trying to have your system talk to a smart card. There actually is a gentleman who we've made contact with. Excuse me. Who is working on a PKI authentication module, which will allow people actually to insert their smart cards into the machine. And his name is Rick Welch. This project is currently in the sandbox, but undergoing final review will allow you to, insert your smart card into the system. It'll communicate with the browser and then give you access that way, and provides that additional means of strong authentication. This is being built as a pluggable platform so that he actually has built the core system to work specifically with the DoD LDAP server and authenticate with that. And we've actually started to develop a sub-module that will allow you to use, we do a lot of work with HHS, will allow you to use those cards specifically. And then other people have the capability to develop other what are known as plugins that can work along with this core system to allow you to use these types of additional devices.
Is there any module that will integrate with Active Directory?
Yes. Actually, the LDAP module, we've used that quite extensively, and it's quite robust. It allows you to use the users and the groups from Active Directory. We've done both of those. A lot of these systems support that. Obviously, SharePoint supports that most strongly, but the Drupal LDAP module, it works very well. It's quite mature on Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. We used it.
You mentioned that you were doing a module to do it for HHS, and then you showed us an example of someone who's working with DoD. How about combining all smart cards and IDs together so that way we could do them all at one time?
Yeah, I think that's the vision of that person, Rick Welch, who's developing that, is that you'd have an architecture, because there's a variety of these systems. And potentially you might have a situation where you not only have people with PIP cards, but maybe there are external users with different types of devices. So that's, I think, exactly the vision there. And I know at least with the SAML module, Drupal makes this, some systems it's difficult with, but I know with the SAML and the LDAP module, it's fairly easy in Drupal to have multiple options for authentication. And so perhaps you need some, in a local system, you need some access to local accounts. But you can limit that in a very restricted fashion so that maybe everyone out there on the broader world has to use some form of multi-factor authentication, and maybe that can vary depending on their capabilities. So yeah, that's great. I think that type of flexibility is absolutely critical.
Just a point of note, since we're in the federal IT security requirements here, Office of Management and Budget has considered it part of their responsibility to integrate all of this together And so if anyone here is looking
Right.
for like Vivint smart card access, they provide a service that will allow you to validate any Vivint smart card directly through them, no matter which branch it's from, which is great because they're keeping all the revocation lists, they're keeping all the cert hierarchy and everything intact, which is extremely helpful.
Right. I believe someone presented on that last year actually at the CapitalCamp. I believe it, yes. They did. So do you happen to know the name of that?
Paul Donahue actually
Right.
heads up into that.
He's I believe, the one who spoke, if I'm not mistaken, last year. But thank you very much. It's very good. Another key requirement in federal IT governance is the ability to do ongoing vulnerability assessment. There's some, we happen to use Drupal provides what is known as the security review module, which will review your code in a dynamic fashion. They also have what is known as the coder and the code review module, and this will do what is known as static code analysis. That basically will examine the structure and the syntax used in the code for potential vulnerabilities, and it's often a very useful adjunct to the other types of dynamic scanners. We look at these other platforms, they also have some specific vulnerability testers. Joomla has, we cited the OWASP project before they have a scanner built on that system. WordPress has a WP security scan system. SharePoint, there's an open source security scanner. And then wasn't able to find any specific security scanners for library. It's important to note that with all these systems, you have to run the generic vulnerability testing along with any specific tools that you have for these platforms. But it's often useful to have some additional tools on top of those, broader types of scanning systems. Depending on the requirements, it can often be very important also to be able to harden your system as much as possible. So to make sure that it's being used effectively, you may have all these potential tools that can make the system secure, but it may be difficult to actually implement those. And so there are some tools that all these systems offer that will give you some assistance with that process. So with Drupal, there's a module available called Harden Drupal, and this is actually a collection of different types of modules that will do things like password, enforce a password policy. Brief look at that. So you see there's a password policy, there's a email change confirmation, someone changed their password by email. There's a review of the login history. And then there's some security tokens, some configuration parameters that are managed by some of these other modules. And you may have noted that ironically one of those had a security concern at this point, which is not at all, unfortunately, uncommon, where you will try to implement one of these security controls. It actually has a vulnerability in it. It's one of the ironies that you often deal with. Okay, so I'd like to move on to the very important topic of continuous monitoring. Typically what you're dealing with, if you're dealing in the federal government realm, there's something known as NIST, I think SP52. This has hundreds of security controls that you have to implement depending on the risk profile of the system. A challenge in adhering to this standard over the years has been that these controls are often managed and need to be implemented in a whole fashion, and there's been little, at least not enough in the way of prioritizing the critical controls in the midst of hundreds of these. the newest version of this standard came out a few months ago, and actually a number of our clients, even before that, have moved from using those controls to manage CNA to what are known as the SANS Top 20 critical security controls, which map back to these, which was place a priority and an emphasis on a core set of controls that more or less take advantage of the old 80-20 rule, that if you implement 20% of the key controls, it's actually going to deal with like 80% of the potential vulnerabilities. With both of these, with both the SANS Top 20 and the new NIST standards, there's a tremendous emphasis on what is known as continuous monitoring. So this is a concept that says, you know, once you have the security controls in place, that's only the beginning. So you need some ongoing structured process to collect information that confirms these controls are still in place and they're still functioning effectively. Two things to point out with regards to that, you know, on top of just implementing monitoring, is the need to know what you might call intelligent application aware monitoring. So it's relatively easy, perhaps, to get a system online that tells you that your web server is up and running. What you may not know is that it's displaying naked people, you know. So Drupal has a plugin for a system known as Nagios, which is it's one of the leading. It's a long-lived open source monitoring system that has a strong community that allows you to get that detailed information into Drupal. And because there are many other Nagios platforms on that, you can then monitor your system in real time, along with the details on the different components of the system that make up your CMS and support the CMS, and figure out how those are being impacted. So you can not only determine how, you know, if people are adding nodes by the thousands suddenly to Drupal, but you can determine if your web server is running out of memory, if someone is trying to log into the database, or those types of things. Looking beyond just a general purpose monitoring system, there's this concept known as the SIEM, Security Information Event Management System. There's a number of these commercial systems that are available. We happen to use an open source system, extensively JBS, called OSIM. And what this type of system allows you to do is customize your monitoring system so that you can more readily perform incident identification and response. It also satisfies a key requirement of the continuous monitoring initiative that makes it important that you take your data, monitoring data, and store it someplace away from the core system where people cannot tamper with it, and where you can, in real time, effectively aggregate, correlate, and analyze that data. So with the OSIM system, there actually is a Drupal plugin for that. We don't happen to use it because there are many ways in which you can get your data into these types of systems. And Drupal provides you some real flexibility in doing that with the Watchdog module, which is the core logging capability of Drupal. The Watchdog module allows you by default to log to a database. You can also log to syslog or MongoDB, which you may be familiar with. There's no SQL database. They give you a variety of options for having more structured data and determining where it can be located. So in what we often will do, at least at JBS, is you have Watchdog point to what is known as remote syslog. That can then be fed into this OSIM system. So you can collect the data there with Drupal along with, as I said, the Nagios monitoring data. You can have intrusion detection systems running on top of all these that report data back into OSIM. So you have a common platform for managing your security, health, and potential incidents. There's also a very popular in the security world community around a system called Logstash now. And this is noted for its capability to analyze the broad array of unstructured and structured data. There's a Drupal plugin for Logstash that actually we don't use because, as with security information management systems, there's a variety of ways to get data in the Logstash. The module that was written for Drupal actually depends on having the database, having Watchdog logged to the database. We, as I said, tend to have it logged to remote syslog. You can then feed that in the Logstash. So Drupal, again, gives you the flexibility to approach these systems to get data into them from a number of ways, depending on how your specific needs. Just looking at some of, some of these, a lot of these other systems also give you capabilities for using tools like syslog. A lot of them have commercial monitoring packages that are available. As far as SharePoint goes, it's built on top. It is richly integrated with the System Center set of tools, which you may be familiar with. Very capable, but also very expensive, and perhaps a little bit less flexible. Let's look at just a brief look at the different hosting platform and environment capabilities that you have with these systems. And without getting into too much detail, you see that there's just a general movement in moving stuff to what is known as the cloud. So that you can put all these systems on something such as Amazon or OpenStack. There are some challenges in moving everything to the cloud, though, because the SOA is that you need is often somewhat nebulous or non-existent. There's also often a issue with, shared data. How is this segment? Where is it stored? So some of these cloud providers are now supporting requirements that's known as FedRAMP, which makes the data more secure from a government standpoint, isolates it, controls it more tightly. I just like to wrap up on this note by briefly touching on those of us in the Drupal community. A couple months ago, many of us received an email that Drupal.org had been compromised. You had to reset your passwords. I happened to see some presentation by the folks that manage the Drupal.org infrastructure. They have a very sophisticated system for controlling the source code, but I think it's just instructive that they said that it was third-party software that was breached. And unfortunately, at the same time, emphasized that it was not the core Drupal platform that had been compromised. Unfortunately, from a user standpoint, from a management standpoint, it really doesn't matter when we get down to it which system was compromised if someone's data is stolen, obviously. This gets down to the core reality that with Drupal, with the security team and the community effort, you're not walking alone, but you also are not walking alone. You cannot walk alone with Drupal. We live in an increasingly interconnected world, and there are other components that you have to manage along with Drupal. And so it's as much, it depends on not only what Drupal gives you, but how effective you take use of this. And so we can say that Drupal allows us to become security ninjas with its core capabilities, but only by managing it and its family of compatriots can we become the security rock stars. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for coming. I'd like to let you know if there are any comments or questions. I'd be happy to.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.